Welcome, everyone, to another inspiring episode of the Sync podcast, where we explore the value of an inclusive approach in the way we think, work, and engage with our communities and workplaces. Where we show that the meaning of inclusion, contrary to what many may believe, is about leaving no one behind. Each episode features candid conversations with thought leaders and change makers driving inclusive initiatives across various sectors. Our goal is to create a community of inclusive-minded individuals and organizations committed to collective and sustainable impact. I'm your host, Nicole Piggott, and today we have a very special guest with us, Alex Snider. Alex is a keynote speaker, strategic advisor, and the host of the Builders podcast. With an impressive career that includes completing a $2 billion divestment in the natural resource sector and tripling the revenues of a tech firm in just 10 months, Alex has led strategic planning and operational improvement for FTSE 100 companies across 4 continents. She now advises impact-driven business leaders on building world-class companies with best-in-category performance. Her insights have been featured at industry-leading conferences such as Volcano Summit, Impact Hub, and Collision Conference. Welcome, Alex Snider. So, Alex, it's great to have you with us today on the Sync podcast. We always kick these off with a little chat about your background and your history. I know you well, but I'd love for my audience to know more about Alex Snider. So give us a little bit of your background. What led you to become a strategic advisor?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Nicole. I'm so excited to be here and to dig into all the good things that we're going to talk about. Yes, you and I do know each other quite well, so you know a lot of the story. I think it sounds kind of wild, but hindsight's always 2020. And when I look back, as I've gone through the last few years of building this business and working with my clients in the way that I work with them now, and understanding kind of my own expertise, my own zone of genius, what drives me and what I'm great at, it actually goes all the way back to childhood because I grew up training as an athlete. And so what I learned in those really formative years from, 4 or 5 years old to sort of, 16, 17, so much of it was strategic, analytical, analyzing a course, a plan, a game, this, and then applying it in real time, learning to pivot, learning to adjust, learning to see what's in front and, attack. Strategy comes from war. And then we turned it into kind of sports and business. But really, so much of that is what I learned through sports. And then on the other side, I learned a lot about leadership in team sports. And I learned my style of leadership is so much around kind of leading almost from behind, like servant leadership, and making sure that everybody understands their role, how it fits into the bigger game plan, that they feel included, really celebrating wins and progress. And I realize it's so much of that, which is, what makes me who I am, which makes me great at what I do, which, allows me to support my clients, actually really, really started back then. So, and even things like learning how we learn, right? So when you train, you are training for a level of elite. You are really drilling in and a skill over and over. And then you're applying it, and then you're finessing it, and then you're applying it, and then you're finessing it. And you also don't get to choose when to go apply it. Like the competition day is this day. So like ready or not, here we go. And that's a lot of entrepreneurship too, right? If you just sit and try to wait until you're perfect, you're never going anywhere. And so I think those elements of like strategic thinking, analytical thinking, learning to pursue excellence, but be able to, play and present and show up in the moment, and really how to lead in a way that inspires and brings a standard of excellence to a group of individuals. I really do think that so much of that started in my time in athletics. And I really am so grateful for that because believe it or not, I was so quiet, so shy. I really never fit in. And yet somehow in this one realm, I really excelled and became a leader. And I think that that's really important to note as well, because we see often leaders that are on magazine covers or
Right.
TV, and we think that everyone who's a good leader is bold and maybe a little, eccentric
Right.
and really outspoken. And actually, if you were to look at the statistics, majority of successful entrepreneurs, they have different kind of zones of genius, but they're not people who are innately camera facing or loud or the first person up. They find what works for them and then they find a way to connect that to other people, both kind of clients and team.
Right. It's funny because I had never thought about it the way you've just described it, that part of what may have contributed to my comfort moving into this space was spending 20 years, 20 plus years as a dancer. You're used to getting feedback, harsh and critical feedback. Sometimes even feedback about things that you can't really change about like I had a dance teacher telling me, you haven't got this type of body, or your turnout will never be what a ballet dancer's turnout. And but that just forced me to say, oh yeah, well, I'm going to push
Yes.
myself to make that happen. And but you start to see feedback as constructive and shaping you and forming you into the better you.
Yes.
Whereas we sort of, when I observe other people and their reaction to feedback, who have not had those sort of that harsh school of sports excellence and
Mhm.
athletic excellence and a dance, they see it as a personal attack and
Yeah.
not as a constructive tool to the better you, the future and better you,
Yes. I think that's such a great, yeah, I love that you pulled that out because I think agree, the way of coaching, especially in the generations that we come from, right? Like there was no parents stepping in back in my day.
No.
They weren't even around most of the time. Like, coaching was pretty rough, pretty direct. And sports also is very, again, you have to take it in and act on it because you're in training, fair enough. You have maybe some time to take in the feedback and work through it. And there are longer arcs of development, let's say.
Right.
But there's also when you are on a field, on a pitch, in a ring, whatever you're doing, and someone is shouting at you from the corner, you instantly take that in and address it if you want to succeed, right? And so the
Exactly.
ability to not only take it as constructive, but also kind of like the rapid iterations, I think is something that sports really teaches you. And your other point about the sort of, I think there is the other side of just being resilient and determined. So I had an experience much later on, not in sports, where somebody basically told me like what I wanted to do was unreasonable, that I should spend more time on my plan B. And I remember being a little bit crestfallen because these were the academic advisors in my master's program, basically telling me that my aspirations were pretty damn lofty and I was choosing the hardest industries to approach
Mm.
and that really maybe I want to spend more time on plan B. And I was like, aren't you supposed to help me like achieve my goals? But do you know what? I look back and I realize despite everything, I was the youngest person in my program. I had so much imposter syndrome. I kind of didn't even like clearly say what I wanted when I got in because I was afraid they would be like, that's impossible. We're not going to take you. But once I was in, I was like, this is what I want, like I'm here to
Good for
play.
you.
And that was probably the best thing they could have said because if they had been like, oh, it's tough, but like, we'll help you, like, I probably would have got there. I don't know. But being told, like, no, check your dreams, I was like, excuse me?
Yeah.
And I went on to be in the top 5% of my class, despite being the youngest, being this. I went on to get one of the only jobs, right? I was during the housing crisis. So one of the only jobs in that industry when people the year before still didn't have jobs. I went on to be asked to come back by those same people to speak to students about the industry, about getting the jobs, about that. And then I went on to excel in that industry. And that sounds
Exactly.
really not humble, and I don't mean it to be, but I actually think the way that I'm wired, probably partly from sports, was like, yeah, tell me it's too high. Tell me it's too big. Tell me I should slow down. Now.
Exactly. And what I'm hearing from you also is you set your goals. Like you don't allow someone else to impose those goals on you. The other thing that you said that really resonated with me, and I should have realized when we met years and years and years and years ago, that that was also something that made us such kindred spirits, is that you are driven by servant leadership, and that's your leadership style and approach. And it's very much my leadership style and approach. I learned servant leadership in my days at FedEx, and it has shaped the person that I have become, and I consider and continue to evolve to be the best servant leader that I can. But for those of you who don't know servant leadership, it's really a way of elevating and driving performance through your team, through driving excellence through the people around you. And your role as a leader is to support and create opportunities and develop and push your team to excellence, um, as opposed to pushing yourself at the forefront of excellence and being at the front. You're behind, pushing your team forward. And through that, you all excel and shine together, as opposed to necessarily often the leader at the front looks like they're the superstar when you're supported by a whole team of
And it,
superstars.
yeah.
So let's shift focus, because one of the things I keep talking here about the fact that we go way back. So for my audience's benefit, Alex and I met in super tense, super intense circumstances where all the things she's just described, she literally had to pull all that out of her experience and baggage to apply those skills in the moment, because we were in a huge high stakes negotiation, but we were also in a world that historically women don't lead. Women aren't necessarily seen as the leaders and the decision makers, and we were also in an environment where the expectation that was set forth for us was to achieve goals that in their 60-year history they had never achieved. So it was to not have a labor stoppage, not to have to have an agreement that was mutually satisfactory, so that we would have optimal performance from the team. So it was unusual circumstances, and you came in, and I'd love for you to share with my audience sort of what that was like and what strategies did you pull on to get the best
Mm.
outcomes? Because, you know, a lot of that stuff was firsts for you, but you wouldn't have known it to watch you.
Yeah, I mean, such an incredible experience. And as you said, intense to say the least. It was my first project after graduating. You were my first client. I got thrown in there. I met you in your office before I even went into my office. So it was wild. It was really amazing though, because one, I really was so excited to dive into the mining industry and understand a lot of the things that I think, people are always like, how did you end up in that? And I said, well, I was really interested in kind of like financial systems and energy and natural resources, because they're two things that people either don't think about or they think are just like terrible. And like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, some parts of it aren't great, but we can't at this point live without them. So, better, why don't we understand them better? And then we went through the financial housing crisis, and I was like, okay, I think we understand what happens when you mess around with
Mm-hmm.
systems. So I was so excited to be coming into your industry. And then I actually had done all these like weekend seminars on negotiation. So it was really incredible timing to get to bring these into a very real situation, as you said, with extremely critical goals and high expectations and serious operational impacts, potential operational impacts. I think what was really amazing is that, you know, across the team that was supporting, we had this incredible depth of knowledge that we were able
Yes.
to leverage into a really solid structure. And I am a fan. I'll try not to have too many tangents here, but I think there's a difference between structure and rules. So I'm a like F the rules. I'll try
Yeah,
sorry,
you're not
try
a
to like
rules
watch my
girl.
language. You know, I'm not a like rules are the be all and end all person. I think there's a lot to be said for challenging them, but I actually think structure sets us free and gives us a lot of flexibility. So we had this truly formidable team with this wide range of skills. And then we turn that into structures across the different components of kind of the process leading up to negotiations, the negotiation table, the roles that we assigned within that framework, and that everyone really, again, speaking about successful teams, knew their role and
Yeah.
held their role, trusting that other people were doing the other roles. And I think the framework was really based on the strategy of mutually beneficial outcomes and
Yes.
truly understanding the needs and the drivers of the people across the table, of the people, you know, that were, I'm going to say, behind us at our table. And I often reflect on, you know, when I'm feeling a little bit challenged about where the world is at, those kinds of experiences and how privileged I am to have experienced so many different people and so many different cultures and be able
Yeah.
to kind of think about why people behave in certain ways
Yes.
and what is important to them. And I think that allows us to connect with people in the world, not just at a negotiation table or at a, you know, a boardroom. And I think for me, it really helps me be more open-minded, a lot less intolerant of maybe views, and be someone who is ultimately quite solutions oriented, really
Yes.
looking at like range of stakeholders. And I think that first project, we did a lot, but I think that first project really exemplifies that. Like we were so intentional and
We were.
so calculated sounds like a bad word, but in this way, I mean it in a good way of not allowing something to, you know, sidetrack the table because of an
Exactly.
emotion or a reaction or a bias or ill-informed, you know, in the moment. Like we really, really had everything so structured and so nailed down that the people at the table, again, they knew what we were there for. They knew what the goal of the day was, the intention, and they were ready to leave space and not react, because that would have been detrimental, right? And we saw that on the other side of the table where
Oh,
they
yeah.
were not going through any of the exercises, practices. I don't want to assume exactly what they were doing, but you know, we had people on the other side of the table who had, I would say, extreme emotional reactions in certain moments that if we had then counter reacted to that,
Exactly.
I mean, you know, it would have been the equivalent of war in a, you know, small negotiations
It
room.
would
You know,
have,
hopefully no one physically would have been hurt,
which
but
is historically what it had been like, right?
exactly. You know, like it would have been that, like, you know, almost like cinematic, like screaming and banging of fists and this. And, you know, there was a little bit of that on the other side of the table, but because our side had practiced all of these skills for months, was so clear that people were able to, what you mentioned even about servant leadership, not take things personally,
Nope.
you know, and sports and all that, like not take it personally, realize that someone was having a reaction, hold some space, maybe ask a question, maybe stay silent, maybe
Yep.
take a break. And these are all things that, you know, thankfully we're hearing more and more. Like these things serve you in all walks of life, right?
So
Like,
true. Like, it's funny, I hadn't even thought about that experience in quite the way you've characterized it. But you're right, it was so formative in casting the right people for their roles. So you had no feeling that you, at any point, that you didn't have the right person in the right roles in all of and it was a complex situation. And there were a lot of different roles. But to
Yes.
your point, everybody knew what their job was at that table, and everybody trusted that the people around them knew what their job was and were going to execute on that, their roles. And that's and it allowed for certain things to happen on the other side of the table that, to your point, didn't derail the process. It could have derailed the process and historically had. The
Yeah.
other thing that, I want to share with our audience that was a real takeaway for both of us was and you just spoke to it, is we were prepared. Like, there were points where we were preparing that you thought, oh my gosh, we have to run through this again. Like, we ran through scenarios
Yeah.
for months, every day, all day, for months. We ran through scenarios, and it allowed for the fact that when you encountered things, even if it wasn't verbatim the scenario that you had done, in your toolbox, you had somewhere something that helped you to respond in the moment. And it was really a tremendous learning experience. Little hint, I had never negotiated before. So I, like Alex, had done all the training in negotiations. I was a certified mediator, but I had never done a labor negotiations before. But I did understand the principles of conversations with people, how to de-escalate a situation, how to negotiate effectively, and it served us really well. So now let's switch gears to Alex leaves all of that work at that first intense, like, do your master's degree and then frankly get a PhD in a huge project that she did with us, which was enormously successful. Not only were we able to achieve goals and milestones within the organization, but we achieved milestones that had never before been achieved in that province
Mm.
before. So we had really, it was successful on every front, and Alex was an integral part of that. And then you went off to work in multiple industries where, frankly, much like mining, people who look like yourself and myself are not in abundance, and certainly not in leadership roles, in roles of influence, guiding decisions. So, what was that like? Like, what were your experiences?
Mm. Yeah, it's funny because for so long, I didn't know any different. I was so achievement and merit driven that I probably was a pretty bad feminist growing up, Honestly, I never fit in. And so and where I did fit in tended to be male dominated. So I was often the only girl and I kind of fit in with the guys and I got along with the guys. And I, you know, like went toe to toe with them and
Mhm.
I pushed, right? I worked on a farm, I played rugby, I worked in medicine, I did a master's degree where we had like a record of women in the program. I think it was 20%. Like that was like a big deal back then. And even within that I chose strategy and finance and those, and then I went into strategy consulting in mining and energy and natural resources. Then I went into mergers and acquisitions. Then I left and went into tech startups. And then
Exactly.
we merged our tech startup into the cannabis space. And like, it's just like, yeah, talk about like just absolutely swimming in the most male dominated industries and streams. And I think, look, over time, I think I realized I was facing a lot of the things that we hear about, and a lot of assumptions get made, and I've had clients assume that I'm an assistant or a junior or
Mm-hmm.
this when we
Mm-hmm.
show up in the office before the introductions get started. And yeah, some of them have had pretty funny reactions when they realize that I'm the director or the project lead or the engagement lead or whatever that title is. And Some are graceful about it, others less
Mm-hmm.
so.
Mm-hmm.
I've had experiences where after, 2 hours of presenting and, 4 years of working with that organization, an executive stands up and asks me what qualifies me to advise them, which I think is not impossible, but would be less likely to happen to, a more typical white male,
Yeah.
colleague. And then I think there's some like more doldrum things where I've had experiences where people have maybe spoken to myself or my team members, honestly, more my team members, because I'm like a mama bear and it's like absolutely not. Um, and they seem like really genuinely surprised when I have held a boundary or stood up to
Mm-hmm.
them, right? And you keep in mind, these are clients paying millions of dollars for our teams to do work. And suddenly there's me saying like, this is not appropriate. Um, you can't engage with the team that way. You can't speak to people that way. I don't think you should speak to anyone in your team that way, but definitely not mine. And we always worked it out once they realized that I
Mm-hmm.
genuinely wasn't. I think I am fortunate, and I want to be careful how I say this, but I was honestly very shut down when I was younger, so I was not very emotional.
Right. Okay.
And I don't think emotions are bad, and I don't think women are more emotional than men. Testosterone makes us
No.
super emotional. But I do think, given, again, not kind of looking like the typical person on the fields that we worked in, being quite
Unflappable.
yeah,
You were
unflappable did help
unflappable. Mm-hmm.
because I was able to, and it doesn't mean that inside I wasn't
Oh
like
no.
feeling whatever, but I think the ability to be quite straight-faced and quite direct and learn when to like stop talking and let someone sit in discomfort when they are very clearly in the wrong and often being quite emotional at me for having called them on something was a massive, massive um just advantage at that point. And I don't even know if I would be that way now. I'm much, more fluid, and I think my face speaks a lot more than it
But
used
you're
to.
allowed to be. I think what I'm hearing from you is something that I experienced, that any woman who has been someone who broke ground in industries or spaces, and I
Mhm.
don't think it's just a woman thing, it's anyone from an underrepresented group forging ground in new territory. We are not afforded the license to do certain things that other people who have traditionally been in that space would get away with. So
Yeah.
having the ability, and I'm sure that you actually drew on your experience in sports,
Yeah.
where there's moments where it's like, listen, I have danced when I have been in excruciating pain because I've got an injury, but the show must go on. And so you just
Yes.
suck it up and you get out there and you did your thing. And then you bawled after, but
Oh, yeah.
certainly didn't bawl in the moment. You did it and you don't even know how you managed to stand
Yeah.
because after that, for some reason, you couldn't stand at all. You just couldn't put any weight on your leg, but in the moment, you're dancing away.
Yeah,
And I'm sure you
absolutely.
went through all that in sports where no one wants to see you sweat. No one is here for it. And
Yeah.
so being in a space where no one is here for it, which is the workspace, you've already built those skills to be able to say, listen, this is not the time. I will have my meltdown, but I'll
Mhm.
have it later.
Yeah.
Or I will not have my meltdown because I've worked it through in my head, or I've built the skills that allow me to sort of compartmentalize this, whatever. These are skills that we have to develop, and they actually serve us in
Mhm.
many ways in
Yeah.
other areas of the work that we do. So it's actually a skill set that you have to develop, but it serves you in many other ways.
Completely agree. And I think, I'll extend that to some of the other places where I've experienced that, where I think what you're saying also is like, no, remember what your goal is,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
in the situation of maybe my team and my dad, I'm like, I have a very clear goal, which is not to blow this project up or to embarrass this executive at
exactly.
all. But I have a clear goal. And so is my reaction is my response in service. And I think response is more what you want than reaction in
Yes.
service to this. And I think it's the same, there's the insidious things too, right? The questions or assumptions that people would make about, lifestyle of like what women are capable of or where your life is going to go,
Hmm.
or whether promotions were given on merit or because you spent so much time with your male colleagues or superiors. They were all male. So like whatever time I was spending was with them. And it's like I could get really upset about that, or I could just keep outworking them,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
Yes.
In startup world was honestly the worst. I did not realize that everyone had some level of boundaries in corporate. And so there were things, but
True.
honestly, when I went into startup world, it was like two sides. I either got asked if I was my business partner's wife, which just like killed me.
Yeah.
Like this was someone who had brought me into their organization because they were like, I need X, Y, and Z, and like you are the person who is going to take us to the next level, and all of these things. And like we had a great relationship, but we're out networking, we're out at this, we're out at events, I'm speaking, and it's always like, oh, are you so and so? Oh, like, are you so and so's wife? Like,
Yeah.
no.
Like, I'm
Um,
still dealing with this,
or I would get propositioned. I would have people set
Uh,
meetings with me with no intention of doing business. And those were hard. Those were tough and frustrating. But the worst was I had someone I considered a mentor for a really long time, very above board. I knew their family. And yeah, there was like long story short, there came a moment where they propositioned me.
hmm.
And I thankfully it was like at a distance, like over email. And it was late and I was, working on something really hard. It was a late Friday night. I was in the office. Our team was out setting up like an event that we were running. It was a really big deal. It was like International
Right.
Film Fest stuff. And I
Wow.
remember getting this email and I cried.
Yeah. Yeah.
I cried and I cried. And I look back and of course I can see it now and it's, nothing to do with me. But I just remember being, this was someone I had mentored their daughter. I had met their whole family, like I,
Yeah.
it would just been this really, great relationship, business and friendship, but very much like a, mentor type role. And yeah, I just remember being absolutely broken by
Because it's
that
so
in the moment.
disillusioning,
It was
you
so disillusioning. And I was like, immediately like, oh my God, this person has never respected me. They've never thought this.
exactly
And, they came around and apologized and this and said, they'd been out for a boozy lunch and
whatever.
this and that. And but I just, yeah, I think that is an experience that is fairly unique to women. And
It is.
yeah, I think if there's like one thing in work that I would, if I could like erase for women, that feeling, it just really rocks you.
It is the one area that I agree with you that de like it takes a lot to destabilize me. It takes a lot.
Yeah,
But that area of taking in a world where you're used to navigating, I don't want to say it's hostile, but where you're always being reminded of you don't quite belong. And in that world, when you cleave to these people who you feel are the people who are in your camp with you, and you discover that they're not who they profess to be, in that vulnerability of like you feel that you can take on the world if you've got those people, but if they're not who you think they are, it just sort of calls into question everybody else in your orbit in a world that's already, I don't want to say hostile, but I mean just not designed for you, designed
that's exactly it. It's not
for,
designed for you. So you are,
exactly,
navigating as a round peg in a square obstacle
exactly,
course. And
exactly.
you have these places where you feel seen and supported and safe to really be yourself.
Right.
And so when one of those kind of changes, it is destabilizing. And I think, I would say the same thing takes a lot to kind of like shake me. But yeah,
Hmm.
like I was very grateful in that moment that I was alone at a, whatever time in the evening on a Friday in the office because I just had
Yes.
a, had a big cry. And then I will say, and you know what, I do not advocate this. Like I think you should have a cry and you should be able to like go home and chill. But I had a cry and then I pulled myself together and got back to work. And then I had to run over to this site because there were some tools
With your
needed. And then I came back and kept working on whatever financial model, and great. I'm grateful that I'm so resilient. And I think that you should actually also be able to sit and process that
yes,
experience. I don't think you should
whatever's
just
what you
get
need
back
to
to
do.
work.
Exactly. But
Um,
you do you, which is what I'm
yeah.
hearing here. But it is a learning.
Yeah. I will say on the other side, I do think that overall, being underestimated, I have found it to be fine. Like, I don't want to say it's amazing because sometimes it's really frustrating, sometimes
Yeah.
it's annoying, sometimes people really push back and tell you like that they thought you were X, Y, and Z when they met you. And then I'm like, well, what do you think now? Like, well, now I've seen you work. So absolutely. I'm like, so was it really helpful to tell me that you thought I was overconfident when you met me? Like, thanks for that. But I do think, I've just always fallen back on hard work,
Yeah.
on experience, and I say that, and then I also see how systematically it's very problematic. And I
Mhm.
think I now make a very concerted effort to mentor women in business,
Yes.
particularly, but in other areas as well. If pretty much anyone who asks me, I will try to find the time to give them at least some element of guidance if I can, because I do think I outworked most people around me. And I didn't see it at the time.
Hmm.
I was doing it because of my own issues around achievement and value and, all
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah.
But I do think systematically it's a problem. And I do think generally most women you see in high positions have had to outwork um,
Yes.
men, not the men that they surpass, but the men who are in equivalent positions.
To get
And I
as
do think
much.
that's a problem.
And it's funny because my mother, she drilled into our heads this whole notion of paying it forward and taking the struggles that you've had to go through to somehow remove a barrier or facilitate someone else's journey. And it's just so that my audience knows, to talk about this full circle. So Alex getting out of her master's degree, first job she gets, she's working with me. And I think we both learned a lot we did multiple projects together, just so that everybody knows, because she was a superstar from the get-go. And then I just kept her with me at every project I had. But when I entered the entrepreneurial space, one of the first people I contacted was Alex to mentor me in this new space for me. So, and I was a very late bloomer when it came to the entrepreneurial space. And I also was someone who was philosophically, as a feminist, frustrated with this pushing women into the entrepreneurial space, because I felt it was a cop out for not advancing women in the corporate world to senior leadership. And we just sort of pushed them into being
Mm.
entrepreneurs as a way of saying, hush, shut up and put up. Like, just go off and do this thing in your little world and stay out of our plate, our sandbox. But I love being an entrepreneur. I've discovered this passion around what I do. And Alex was a key advisor for me in a new space. So, talk to me about, being a female entrepreneur and in, you know, non-traditional industries for women. Like, tech is not
Yeah.
a space that you see a lot of female entrepreneurs unless they're doing sort of female type tech. I hate to say this, but
Mm.
that kind of thing. So, what's the biggest misconception about success, that you wish more people understood in the entrepreneurial space, and the role of
Yeah.
authenticity? Because I found that authenticity has been sort of my guiding light, but it's also been something that I've had to manage.
Mm. Yes. Okay. Let me first just say thank you so much for those kind words. And you were actually, I think, probably my first kind of female mentor or even just woman in business I got to look up to, and one of very few I had in my career. So I love this
Oh,
circular nature, but you've been mentioned in magazine interviews and things I've given because you were really it I think it's very serendipitous that I got to work with you coming right out of my program, and we did so many groundbreaking projects. And it was just, yeah, it was really amazing. So I just want to say thank you for that. And then I will never forget when you reached out to me and said that you had a challenge and that I was the first person you thought of.
without hesitation.
Yeah, I do think that that is really invaluable, and I understand that now in a way I just didn't understand when I was younger because I just, I just existed in a very male dominated world.
Right.
I think entrepreneurship is, I mean, it's so much less sexy and more lonely than what we see online. And don't get me wrong, I love that it's out there. I love that people are more aware of it
Yes.
or talking about it. I don't love that everyone is selling you the course of how to leave your 9 to 5 and make
Ugh,
$1 million and like
no,
have your private jet
no,
because it's bullshit.
no.
But um, you know, entrepreneurship in general, regardless of gender, is just truly the personal development course that none of us signed up for. It will bring up, all of your stuff.
Yep.
And I think you have to confront a lot of it in order to succeed and to enjoy it. Because if you don't,
Yes.
you're going to be fighting. And I think that's where a lot of the authenticity comes in. You say authenticity. I look at the stack underneath. I look at self-awareness.
Yes.
I look at, you know, emotional regulation. I look at communication and boundaries and all of these things that give you the platform to show up as you. Because to show
Yes.
up as you isn't just, I say what I say, and I joked about watching my mouth, but like, yeah, you know what? Like my mouth isn't that corporate anymore, and that's part of my brand, and that's who I am, and the people I work with are fine with that. And the people who aren't, that's fine. Right? It's like you don't want to be vanilla because
No.
no one is going to war for vanilla, right? No,
Exactly.
nobody hates it, but nobody is declaring it's their favorite and arguing with their friend. You want to be that unique flavor that the 10% of people who love you and they keep coming back for more. And it's a little divisive, but like that's what you want to be. And that's when we talk about authenticity, that's what it is. Because when you're authentic, it calls in the clients, it calls in the colleagues, it calls in,
Yes.
the partnerships and everything that match your vibe. It's your values. It matches your values.
So true.
It's what you want to feel when you show up to work, which is the beautiful thing about entrepreneurship. If you do it right and you're genuine, you build something that you enjoy and you attract people who also enjoy it from,
Exactly.
again, client and colleagues and team members. But I think the role of authenticity, to truly be authentic, there is a lot of work that goes in to
Yes.
being able to be authentic. And I think that is something that also changes. And if you cannot recognize when you are going through an evolution and accept it, and it doesn't mean you have to broadcast it the minute it starts happening,
No.
but if let's say, over the period of 3 or 4 years, you really shift, you expand your view and you shift and you have these things and you try to stay in this, front facing version of you, like that dissonance is
Yeah.
exhausting.
Doesn't work.
And the people around you, like as humans, we have bullshit meters,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And with the advent of the internet, that is even bigger just in the sense of we live our lives more online, information is more available. There's an expression that's, how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that so much was like away from work, and entrepreneurship has always been, more
Yeah.
bonded, I'm going to
Symbiotic.
say.
Yeah.
But, used to be things were away from work and you kind of showed up at work and people just knew you there and that was it. And people accepted that it was more separate, right? You
Mm-hmm.
look at the cliche of, the boss is respected, but he cheats on his wife and on this, and he's
Exactly.
what cheats at poker, I don't know, whatever version of, not being in
Or
integrity.
speaks about all these values that they profess to have around the taking care of their people, or
Yeah.
integrity in all of their practices. And then behind the scene, you see someone who's doesn't give a poop about their people and doesn't
Yeah.
like that dissonance.
Yeah.
You're right. You
And
can't get
speaks
away with that the way
down
you
and
used
breaks
to. Yeah.
trust. And, that just
There's,
isn't going
yeah.
to cut it
No, I agree.
these days. And, again, people have this internal meter where we're like, something doesn't feel right. And the world
Hmm.
is different. People are just like eventually gonna be like, that's just
Yeah,
no.
forget it.
Or
Yeah.
it's actually information that is visible, is available, and people can more objectively say, well, that just doesn't align and that doesn't feel great, right?
But it's so true, because as I hear you talking, one of the reasons why it's been fairly fluid as we've grown our business and our firm is because I spent the time on the front end. I have real clarity on what our mission is, what our values are, what we're trying to accomplish as a business, and why we're here, why we show up, and why we're here. And so I don't get swayed, deviated off course. That doesn't mean that there's not cool, interesting ideas that come to play that take us in a new direction, but they're always tied to that core. And part of it comes from being who I am. And the reason we started this was something that was burning within that I really wanted to do. And so I love that you're saying that it's you have to take the time to really understand who you are, and that investment makes everything else sort of come flow into place, fall into place.
Because I start with my clients with this, right? Like I do strategy, I do
Yes.
operations, I do, structure and team and process and governance, but I start with the vision. And that is, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
What are the values of the organization, which should tie to yours. They're not going to be one for one, but what is this? What are the values of this entity that you are creating, this
Yeah.
experience? And also, what do why are you doing this in the bigger picture? And then what do you want your life to be like when it gets there? What's your role? What's this? How does that look? How does it feel? Because it is so easy to get swept up in shoulds or the new
Yep.
thing. And what I say is, one, there's no wrong answer. Like, be honest with yourself so you can be honest with me, because we are going to work hard
Mhm.
to build something. So you might as well build something that at the end feels good and you don't resent it and it's not draining you,
Right.
right? But also really be honest, because I actually don't think there's a wrong answer. I think we don't want to admit things because we have judgments about them a lot of the
Yes.
time.
Yes.
But, you know, so many of my clients, a lot of them are like first generation of an education level or of a business owner or
Yes.
of a certain level. And so they're like, well, I want to earn, like, they don't want to say, like, I want to earn this much. They're like, I want to do good things for my team. And they do. They genuinely are too nice. My clients are all too nice. I love that. Like, I love that brand. Like, I'm that way too. Right. And like, too nice is sometimes a disservice. So we just we have to like transform the nice. But
Exactly.
they don't want to say things like, well, I want to earn this much money. And I'm like, first of all, there's nothing wrong with money, right?
No.
And I have all kinds of money stories. I was like, oh my God, I'm not like starving. I need to martyr myself. So like, don't get me wrong. This comes from a place of empathy, but it's like, well, for most of them, when you really break it down, because I ask some hard questions, they want to earn money to be able to provide stability for their
Exactly.
family or to build something in their community or to, pay off their parents' mortgage because their parents worked 5 jobs to allow them to like go to school because their parents didn't get to. And I'm like, in what world? Like that is not bad. That's
Did you feel bad
beautiful,
about that? Exactly.
right? Like that's
Exactly.
amazing. There's other people who have other reasons. And I'm just like, yes, I love it. If you come to me and you're like, Alex, I want to change the world, love it. I want to save the world, love it. Love it. But wanting to earn money to like change the game for your family or your community,
It's fine.
amazing. You
Exactly.
know?
But you know what you're I want the audience to capture this, because I came to Alex and she helped me early on, and then as we were growing, she came in again to help us, and she'll come in again. And but I had never taken the time to actually ask myself the question that Alex has just put in front of us here. I never thought about the money piece. I know it sounds weird. It sounds really weird to someone say they're an entrepreneur and they never thought about what is your goal money wise. But it always been the goal of the mission of the organization. And I never factored in to what size, to what like is it for sale? Is it to set it up to be sold? Like all of these things that I'd never asked myself that Alex helped me to get clarity on. And putting it through the lens of to do what, which is another thing I hadn't thought about that Alex brought to the conversations that she and I had, has really also given me a lot of clarity around the decisions I make going forward. So both organizationally, how we structure the business, is future focused. The decisions we make about the products and services that we develop and launch is like it's through this lens of where are we going, and that's a piece of that we don't think about. And I think there is a female element to that we women are sort of socially, it's drilled into our head to almost think that asking for money or asking about money or aspiring to make big money is some sort of anathema or some sort of judgment on, you're this, that, and the other. Whereas to your earlier point, I'm not convinced that if a white man set those goals, those lofty goals, not that other goals aren't lofty, but had set those concrete goals to make more money for XYZ reason, that anyone would cast any judgment on those decisions.
Yeah.
So I think that's where some of that comes from. It's like, does this mean I'm a bad person because that's what I want?
Mhm. Yeah.
So
And I love helping people. Impact is what gets me out of bed. And
yeah,
the dwindling impact with the mounting amount of money in consulting is part of why I left, right? So like I love it. And there is a part of me that's like, I wish I could just help everybody for free. Amazing.
but
But
you can't.
learning to ask for and accept, remuneration for the value that I provide. And as someone who grew up very in their masculine, like
Mm-hmm.
has been massively difficult. And I think to your point, I would say, we're veering into other topics, but like masculine and feminine, I operated on my masculine for most of my career, most of my life. And I've really worked to find more balance
Right.
in a way that works for me, not because I should, not because anyone's telling me, but like
No.
recognizing where I don't feel great or different things and starting to explore that. But I do think so much of the work I do, whether it's for men or women in like clients, I have both. I used to work only with men just because that's where I came from. And I love now that I have a more balanced, client network. But I
Right.
think that part of what I ask, it's the more structure, it's the more masculine, because also if you aren't setting, whether it's, money, reach, size, whatever goals, then you can't measure to know whether you're making progress. To your point, you can't just make decisions about allocating your resources, time, energy, money, whatever.
Exactly.
And the funny thing is, I think the feminine side of like, take a minute, slow down. How does that feel when you think about it? Helps people make those more structured masculine decisions and goals in a way that's more true to themselves. Because I think otherwise, to your point, we're going to just make them based off of whatever script, right? So either like,
Exactly.
I think money is fine, maybe I'm more of a man, whatever, or masculine energy.
Yes.
Money is great, super, super specific goals, this hard work, whatever. Or I'm someone who's the other, and I'm like, it's just about impact, it's just about this. And if you actually sat and thought about it in your body a little bit more, and you projected yourself to the future of how do you want your days to look? What are you great at? What do you want to be doing with your time and energy
Exactly.
versus the organization? Like that. So it's an interesting interplay between those kind of more masculine and feminine. But I don't know, I think, and this, I mean, the data shows it, like men and women together is ultimately
Yeah.
optimal for business. And I think women, we just, for better or for worse, in today's day and age, are socialized differently.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole
Mm-hmm.
conversation about that.
Around that.
But I think that women, when we're not caught up in, competitive patriarchy
Yep.
BS, we build more flat hierarchies and cohesion. And I think we leverage diversity in ways that are really interesting. And so I think combining that
Oh,
with, again, are socialized too, but like if we can combine those and bring everybody's skills and strengths and different ways of working in a respectful manner where we can, debate and hash it out, because you can't do everything all the
mhm.
time. You have to make decisions and go certain ways. But I think there's so much power in that. And I think I think that is something that through a lot of work as individuals, we can bring different components of ourselves to a table. But ultimately, it's that old adage, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
It's so funny because I'll never forget years and years ago, a team that I was leading in a large multinational company won sort of team of the year. And it was the first Canadian, it was a US based company, and it was the Canadian division. It was the first time the Canadian team won this award. And I remember people asking me, what is the secret sauce? And your point is really valid around diverse thoughts around the table. I said, listen, sometimes you gnash your teeth on how long it takes to make a decision and to like talk something through, but I am never disappointed with the outcome. I always feel that the ultimate outcome is better, uh, more sustainable, but more importantly, speaks to a broader spectrum of people because we worked in a service industry, and so speaks to a broader spectrum of the population than if we just had a bunch of people who sort of thought the same thing and felt the same way and responded the same way. We probably would have had something that was successful and spoke to a segment of the population.
Right.
But I invariably our product ends up being a beacon to people that people go, oh wow, this is incredible. And the secret is not a secret. It is the variety of thoughts that are brought to the table. One of the things
Yeah.
I did want to finish on, there's two things I want to ask you before we wrap up. But one of the things is female entrepreneurs are as successful as male entrepreneurs. The data is
Mhm.
just the data. The data is what the data is.
Mhm.
Yet we struggle to get funding, to get financial support. Why do you think that is? Like, what would be the advice? Because you've been there advising people. So,
Yeah. Um, it's such a good question. I think we could fill the whole podcast with this.
just on this.
Look, I think the challenge comes down to a lot of what we've talked
Mhm.
about, the lens with which women are viewed in business, the expectations and societal programming.
Mhm.
I think some of it comes down to connections and community, right? So there is the old boys club has been around forever. That is something that is still very new for women. I
Mhm.
think because women, and this is part of their success, but the way that it can translate when you're out in the investor world. So women tend to give credit to the team. They tend to be servant leaders, which means
Yeah.
they don't always talk themselves up as much, which a great investor will see.
Right.
But someone who is used to somebody shoving their accomplishments in their face and, believing that person that looks just like them, of course they must be great. Yeah, I think there's a gap there. And I
Right.
think women, again, part of why they're great, they tend to reinvest in the organization. And
Yes. Mm.
therefore, on paper, sometimes the numbers again, if you're a great investor, you know how to ask the right questions. And again, as a woman, get some coaching on how to present this. But the reinvestment in the organization rather than removal of profit can make the numbers look different. So there's a lot of things there. I think this might be an unfair statement, so I'm just going to caveat it, but I will say today, there is a segment of women entrepreneurs who are dealing with women problems because nobody has been tackling those.
Yes,
And
true.
again, that is so valuable. But if what's the person sitting on the other side of the table from you has not experienced that problem because they're not a woman, they don't necessarily see the value of it and how
Right.
big it really is and how much people will be willing to pay for that problem to be solved. So I thought of it comes down to the same things. Now, what can you do about it? One, get some guidance on showing up when you're pitching for either partnerships or funding. Make sure you're asking for enough. I think that's the other thing.
Yeah.
It's a fine line of you need enough runway to prove yourself before you ask for more money. Otherwise, you're just going to constantly be raising and diluting yourself. But at the same time, you don't want to ask for so much that,
But
it's kind of wild. Or you have, you give away too much equity at a lower valuation
yes.
because there's not enough momentum behind you. So get some guidance, like find the right mentors to help you define all of that, help you how you present it. And again, authentically. So find your
Yes.
version, but don't allow too much of the things that are your strengths to hamstring you in fundraising and investor conversations. So that would be one thing I would say.
Yeah.
I think the other is understand yourself and own it and go and find your communities. And whether that is, and don't be afraid to ask for help, basically, is what I'm saying,
Yeah.
but like figure out where to ask for it. And whether that community is women, other women founders,
Mm-hmm.
women business
Mm-hmm.
owners, women investor networks, which thankfully are coming up and up and up. And, Canada has a really solid number of funds that focus on female entrepreneurs, which I'm
Yes.
so excited about. But it also might be around something about your business or about you. So it
Yes.
might be your, wherever you're from, if you're from a tight-knit, either religious or ethnic
Right.
community, it might be that community. If you're building something that is fundamental to a community, go find your users and through them find opportunities for people who can contribute. It might not be investors, but there's a lot
Right.
of ways to
I
contribute to
love
the growth
that.
of a business. So that's the advice that I give to women founders, and it's a lot of advice and it's hard. But I do think that entrepreneurship is hard no matter what. And that's
Yeah.
why I
It's
say,
true.
it isn't for everyone, not in a gatekeeping way, you have to love the challenge. You have to have the resilience. You have to, cliche as it is, get up 10 times after falling down 9 and be kind of
That's
jazzed
so
about
true.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And it doesn't mean you
Yeah.
can't have a hard day and you can't have a cry and you can't have the day where you
No,
just want to stay
no.
in bed. Like,
But you've got to be able to take that knock on the chin
yeah.
and say, I'm going to learn from that knock on the chin and how am I going to take that learning into the next challenge, etc. But I
Yeah.
can tell you, as someone who's relatively new to the space, we founded Synclusiv in 2020. Some of those knocks on the chin, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm sick and tired of of losing money or spending money on something that was a dud. But you have to spend the money on the duds to get to that diamond. And so, but it's something that we're not used to thinking of. Alex, this has been so wonderful. This conversation has been so, I've really enjoyed this conversation, but we've had so many. But I
So
really,
many. I love
it's
it.
nice to sort of sit down here and share how fantastic you are with my audience. And, one of the things that I've heard from you is the core things that drive you as a person, as an entrepreneur, as a business professional. How do you stay true to those values in what you do? Like that's our Sync Spotlight. It's the question we ask everybody at the end
Mm.
of our podcast because it's the thread of everything that we do. So how do you stay true to that?
It's such a good question. I mean, at the core, I help CEOs to really restructure the way they run their businesses, not just the business itself, but the way they run it so that they can scale without sacrificing their life. And when I say their life, I mean their values, their boundaries, their priorities, that exist beyond the business and who they are that makes them amazing and unique and is what created the business. So I set my business up from day one around impact, because impact is what gets me out of bed, both in my client work and in kind of the space and the resources that I have to create impact in different organizations and spheres. And I know that I'm very privileged to be able to be selective about who I work with. And so I work with impact-driven leaders and executives. I work, as I said before, with people who often almost care too much. And we have to work in how we translate that to effective boundaries and processes and governance and, frankly, selection, of people. And so I think what is, often like we do what we need the most, right? So like what I do for my clients is the same thing that I have had to go through for myself, where I have really had to stay in touch with what drives me and why I'm doing what I'm doing, and whether it's having the impact I would like and intend in the world, but also whether it is allowing me to be authentic and be a healthy, happy version of me. And so, I talk about, and this like can be a bit of a controversial word, like wealthy leadership.
Ooh.
Because I believe that wealth is growing a business that achieves what you want to achieve in the world, whatever that is, that earns you enough money to comfortably live and pursue the things that are important to you, whatever those might be. We're all in different circumstances, but within which you get to be healthy, right? So for me, wealth includes health.
Yes.
Right? And that's mentally, physically, right? That's sleeping in a way that works for you. That's moving your body in a way that works for you. That's nutrition. That's all of that. And then also having the bandwidth for whatever your values and priorities are. And for majority of my clients, those are elements of family and community.
Yeah.
And I think for far too long, there is a belief or a mantra that you have to sacrifice those things to build the business and the money. And for me, wealthy leadership is not about sacrificing those things. There are hard days, weeks, months. There are times we grind a little. Everything, balances the equilibre. We're bilingual today. It will shift. But if you are clear, if your plan and your clarity, then strategy that guides your decisions is clear, then you will be able to have all of those. And that is what I believe, that's the life I'm building. And that is what, my business helps other people do. And so, very, very fortunate to be able to have it be so clear for me.
Yeah. And that value, it drives what you do. Your values drive what you do. Well, Alex, it's been such a treat. Thanks so much for joining us this inaugural year of our podcast. It would not have been right without having you with me. And so I really appreciate you joining us and sharing your brilliance and your experience with the audience, with my audience, because I've known what you bring to the table and I've watched you pretty much from the beginning and evolve into this powerhouse, badass, business leader, but driven by core values of impact and staying true to yourself. I think you're a role model, and I just so appreciate having you in my life and in my orbit. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It was such a pleasure, and thank you. I can't say thank you enough for all your glowing words. They really touch me.
Well, comes from the heart. Thanks for tuning in to the Sync podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. The Sync podcast is brought to you by Synclusiv, where we're building inclusive workplaces that work for everyone. To learn more about how Synclusiv can help your organization create real, measurable change, visit synclusiv.com. Until next time, stay in sync.